Well, hey, thank you for joining the Bible Companion podcast. My name is Daniel Newberry. I have been a pastor for a number of years now, and I'm someone who is just very passionate about making theology accessible to every person every day. I believe that the Bible is readable, that the Bible is understandable, and that you don't need to have a theology degree in order to understand it. The purpose of this podcast is to make theology accessible and to bring theology into your everyday life in a way that is simple and applicable. So with that said, let's jump on into today's episode. Well, we are continuing our trek through the book of Genesis. So we're in Genesis chapter 1, and today we're going to be looking at verses 3 through 25. And this is your middle section of the creation story where we actually see most of the action happen. God creates everything that we know on planet Earth and in the sky. Basically, all of creation is talked about in these days. The only thing we're not going to cover in these first 25 verses is the creation of mankind. We're going to set that aside for the next episode. But in today's episode, we're just going to talk about the 6 days of creation. Then we're going to talk about the creation of man, and then we're going to talk about the 7th day of creation. So these next 3 episodes, we're going through the first chapter of Genesis, as well as just the first few verses of chapter 2, very slowly, very in depth. I'm going to try to keep today's episode short because we're covering a lot of content. So I'm probably not going to touch on everything you want to touch on, but I am going to try to touch on the things that I think are important. And again, remember, our main focus is to ask the question, what is the main cohesive story that we see through the Genesis chapters 1 through 3 that then continues through the entire Bible? So in this first season, my hope is that we can get through the whole Old Testament. We're not covering everything, but get through the entire Old Testament and find this one cohesive story again and again and again and again, and see how that story progresses through the Old Testament. And then in season 2, theoretically, hopefully, we're going to get into how this story progresses into the New Testament. How and why does the New Testament rely on and link to the Old Testament? So, if you've ever wondered, how does the Old Testament, what's the story? How are these books laid out? Why does all this matter? How does this progress continually? That's what we're going to talk about. So, looking at chapter 1, last week we talked about verses 1, 2, and we also mentioned 3, these first couple of verses in Genesis 1. We talked about how God is a creator, and he is a creator who cares for his creation. So God, he creates everything. We are the created things, and he cares about his creation. When his creation is distorted, broken, chaotic, he gets close, personal, intimate, right? And he tries to fix his creation. He doesn't just try. He succeeds. He fixes his creation. So today we're going to then look at the process of that creation, verses 3 through 25. And exactly what it is he's doing. So I think the best thing for us to do is for me to read these first 25 verses to you. That way we've said the story, and then we'll break it down piece by piece. So I'm going to pull up my Bible right here on my iPad, and I'm going to read it in the Christian Standard Bible. That's my preferred translation. My opinion, it's the best translation. So Genesis chapter 1, I'm going to start in verse 1. We're really going to focus on verses 3 through 25, but we're going to start in verse 1 just to get all the context. If you are in a spot where you can read along, I encourage you to do it. If you're driving, I definitely encourage you to just listen. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was an evening, and there was a morning, one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters, separating water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse sky. Evening came, and then morning, the second day. Then God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the land earth, and the gathering of the water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit, with seed in it according to their kinds." And it was so. The earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, and then morning, the third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for seasons and for days and years. There will be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule over the day and the lesser light to rule over the night, as well as the stars. God placed them in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth, to rule the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, and then morning, the fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters swarm with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the large sea creatures and every living creature that moves and swarms in the water, according to their kinds. He also created every winged creature according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth." Evening came, and then morning, the fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. So God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Okay, so we're talking about these first 25 verses, and most of us have heard this story before. Most of you listening to this are not going to hear me teaching this and think, "Wow, that's news." You've heard this story. You know how these first 6 days of creation go. You know how God created everything. As we are looking at these first 6 days, the first 6 days here, I want us to consider a different approach than maybe you've come at this passage before. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that is going to betray your belief systems. I'm not going to try to say or ask you to do anything that might contradict anything you've ever been taught. But I am going to ask you to do something that is going to make you possibly slightly uncomfortable with the way we're going to approach this text. As we are reading through this and as we are discussing not only this passage today, but the next few episodes as we walk through these first 3 chapters of Genesis, I want to ask you to take your Bible knowledge, the knowledge you have of what happens after Genesis 3 and the rest of the Bible. I want you to take that. I don't want you to forget it, but I want you to take it. I want you to put it in a box. I want you to shut the box. I want you to lock the box, and I want you to put it to the side for now. Okay? I want you to not interpret these first 3 chapters with the knowledge that you have about the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible, when we interpret the Bible, when we go towards determining doctrines and what we believe about Scripture, we have to include the whole Bible. But in order to understand each individual passage, we need to take it in the context in which it was originally written. If we take it with the knowledge of the rest of the Bible, we're going to miss stuff in the first few verses. So there's a time to include the rest of the Bible, and there's also a time to just say, what do these verses tell me? So I want to ask you, just for these first few chapters, put that knowledge of the rest of the Bible away. Put the knowledge of Jesus away, put the knowledge of salvation away, put the knowledge of the gospel away, put the knowledge of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, put all those things away, and just take these verses for what they are. It would also be helpful to take modern day knowledge and put it away as well. Here's an example of how we often come to this passage very specifically with the wrong questions and the wrong motives. We come into this passage with scientific minds. We come in with from a culture that is a culture obsessed with evolutionary theory, a culture that doesn't know how to draw the line between scientific knowledge and biblical knowledge. We don't know how to take those two things and bring them together. And so what happens is when we have questions about the scientific world around us, unfortunately, we go to this Genesis passage and we try to insert those questions into the text. And there is a time and place for that. There are scholars such as Ken Ham who have done that, and they've done it very well. I have no interest in debating that. But I do think that if that's our only way of looking at Genesis chapter 1, then we're going to miss a lot of what the original authors wanted us to hear and to read. So, what I'm going to ask you to do is to put those questions away. One theologian said, when we ask questions that the Bible doesn't ask, we get answers that the Bible doesn't give. When we ask questions that the Bible doesn't ask, we get answers that the Bible doesn't give. So as we're approaching this text in Genesis chapter 1, I want us to ask the questions that the original audience was asking, the original hearers were asking. So with that said, let's look at this passage again, and let's understand it not from the perspective of a science book, but instead from the perspective of which it was truly written, and actually that's as a poem. It's important to understand that Genesis 1 was not a science textbook. It wasn't written to dispel the evolutionary theory. It was actually written as a poem to a very specific people to tell them a very specific thing. We are not the original audience, so we have to ask ourselves questions that the original audience would have asked so we can understand what the original audience would have understood. We need to put ourselves in the mindset of the original audience, and the original audience was not asking questions about evolution. They weren't asking questions about science. They were asking questions about who God was in comparison to the Egyptian gods that they had come out of, the slavery to Egypt, right? They came out of Egypt. They knew of the Egyptian gods. They also knew of the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I said Isaac. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They knew of that God. And so they wanted to understand him better. And so when Moses writes this book, he's writing it to those people who are asking those questions. He's not trying to dispel Darwin's theory of evolution. So if we really want to get the most out of this, we need to read it from that perspective first. So Genesis 1 actually should be understood as a poem, not a science book. That's your first probably big point on this. Genesis 1 needs to be understood as a poem, not a science book. The Bible is full of poetry, and when we come across different literary genres in the Bible, we need to take them for what they are and then try to understand them from that perspective. So because it's a poem, and you know what, let me give you some examples of how it is poetic in its nature. You see patterns in this that are very poetic. For example, we see several repeated phrases. Evening and morning is repeated every single day. Then God said is repeated at the start of each day. And it was so is a repeated phrase. God saw that it was good is a repeated phrase. There's this element of God says something comes into creation and it was good. So you have this pattern of God said, it happened, it was so, and God saw that it was good. And then there was evening and there was morning. So these patterns, these repetitions point to a poetic structure. In fact, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but in fact, in Hebrew literature, this poem would be understood as a chiastic poem, as a chiasm. And so because it's a chiasm, what that means is that the poem reflects on itself. So there's different kinds of poems, and there's different kinds of chiasms. I'm going to talk more about this chiastic structure in a little bit, but just understand that this is, when we read this, the original readers would have said, this is a chiasm. This is a chiastic poem. That's how they would have seen it. Another just little point, again, why we should not approach this from a scientific perspective. A lot of people look at this and say, well, we can dispel the evolutionary theory simply by saying there's 7 literal days of creation, not billions of years for things to evolve. While I definitely agree things did not take billions of years to evolve, I also don't think that we can just say that these 7 days are literal 7 days. Because the word for day is yom. It's the Hebrew word yom, and it just means particular amount of time. It just means a specified amount of time. It's often translated as day in the Old Testament, but it's not always interpreted as meaning a 24-hour day. Sometimes it's the day of the Lord. Other times it's in that day, such and such thing will happen. And other times it is a 24-hour day. When it talks about in the Bible, the implication seems to be it's a 24-hour day, but I don't think that we can come in and say, well, now we can dispel all scientific evolutionary theory. While I don't agree with scientific evolutionary theory, I want to handle Scripture the way it should be handled. So I'm not quick to jump on board in that way. Again, the Bible's not a science book. Chapter 1 of Genesis is not a science textbook. It's a poem. We need to understand it as a poem. So let's try to dissect this and just pull this apart. In Genesis 1, in these first 3 days that we read, God does he does a lot of one thing, and then in the second 3 days he does a lot of another thing. And if you reread this passage, you're going to see this. That in the first 3 days, there's a lot of separating, and there's a lot of gathering going on. Actually, there's only one gathering, but there's a lot of separating going on. In fact, if you look at it in verses 4, verses 6 through 7, verses 9 through 10, 14 and 18, we see this. Look at verse 4 again, if you can. Verse 4, God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Verse 6, God said, let there be an expanse between the waters, separating water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water from the expanse. Verse 9, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place. There's your one instance of gathering in these first 3 days. He saw that it was good. He called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the water he called seas. And then there was separation going on in verses 14 and 18. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate day from night. Verse 18, these lights are the greater light is to rule the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. So there's this idea of separating going on. Why is separating so important? Well, think about this from the context of what happened in Genesis 1 and 2. God came into the scene. God creates, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? But then in verse 2, the earth was formless and empty, right? We talked about this last week, tohu vavohu, formless and empty. And so when we look at this, tohu vavohu, there's chaos going on. Last week we talked about how there's a lot of chaos going on in God's creation, and God doesn't just leave his creation to be chaotic. Instead, he actually brings order. And that's what we're seeing in this chapter here, this passage. God is a God who brings order out of chaos. And to start bringing order, he starts by separating. I think of it like this visually. My wife has, like most women, she has a bunch of necklaces. She loves necklaces. My wife's a big fan of jewelry. And so she has a lot of necklaces, and sometimes these necklaces, when they're put in their little drawer, in their little jewelry drawer, they kind of get tangled up sometimes over time. And so you get this big knot of just necklace chain, and it's really hard to determine which one it goes where. And so what ends up happening is I take this big knot and I just start pulling. I just start pulling it to try and see where does this thing separate? Where does it come apart? And eventually, as I separate, I pull, I can separate these chains from one another, and I can bring order to the chaotic knot. That's what we see God doing. God begins by separating everything. And then in the second 3 days, he moves from separating, and instead he starts filling. So first he takes the chaotic knot, that is the tohu vavohu, the formless and void earth, and he separates it, and then he starts filling it. He starts giving it purpose. He starts giving it life. And so in verses, where we see this, verses 11 through 12, 14 through 18, 20 through 22, 24 through 25. We're not going to get to it today, but obviously 26 through 30, where he creates man. We see him filling things. Let's look at verses 11 through 12, 14 and 18. It says in verse 11, then God said, let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and fruit trees on the earth. The earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds, right? Verse 14, God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, right? They will serve as signs for seasons, for days and years. There will be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth. So there's this God starts filling, and then in verse 20, God said, "Let the waters swarm with living creatures," and God saw that it was good. And so God takes these elements and he separates waters. He creates the expanse. He separates the expanse from the waters. He separates the waters from the dry land, and he separates the sky. And then he starts filling these things. He puts stars in the sky. He puts birds in the expanse. He puts fish in the waters. He puts animals on the dry land, and trees and fruit. He starts filling. He starts creating life. So God steps in. He separates, and then he fills. There's a lot going on in this Genesis 1 passage that is about God taking a chaotic situation and bringing order to it as well. And then we actually have a very specific thing, kind of a break in the pattern, or maybe not a break, but maybe it's almost like an evolution. There it is. I'm using the word evolve there. Using this idea of evolution, like it kind of evolves, not in a scientific way, but I mean like structurally. God says this, and it was so, and then there was morning and evening. God says this, it was so, there was morning and evening. Well, when you get to day 5, verse 20, God said, let the water swarm with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the large sea creatures, every living creature. Okay, I'm going to skip down to verse 22. And God blessed them. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the waters of the sea, let the birds multiply on the earth. Evening came, and then morning the 5th day. So God, the passage, I say evolves, the passage kind of progresses. And in this pattern, we now add to it. Something new has appeared, a blessing from God. God speaks to his creation, and he blesses them. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters of the sea. Let the birds multiply on the earth. There's this idea of filling, and there's this idea of blessing. He's interacting with his creation. God is a God who, he doesn't just create order, but he creates life, and he becomes intimate with that life, and he speaks tenderly and lovingly to it, blessing it. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. It's amazing that God creates a creation that keeps on creating. He makes something that keeps creating. God's ideal version of creation is something that keeps going, keeps progressing. In this Genesis 1 story, we're trying to understand what the story of the Bible is. I think understanding progression in the Genesis narrative is significant, that God creates things to continue creating, to continue progressing. Ancient readers would have studied and analyzed these texts, similar to how we love to watch television, right? And so you and I love to watch television. I'm a big Marvel fan, big Star Wars fan. I'm a nerd in those ways, and so I love watching these movies, and I love seeing the little Easter eggs between the movies. The more you watch, the more you see. Well, ancient readers would have read this passage in a similar way that we would have watched those movies and shows. And so you and I, we read it, and we go, okay, God created everything. Chapter 2, let's move on. But that's not what they would have done. They would have read it. They would have read it again. They would have read it slowly. They would have focused on just a little section. They would have thought about it. They would have questioned it. And they would have asked so many questions about it. And it would have led them to notice little nuggets that we miss when we read it so quickly. This is where we're going to talk about the chiastic structure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about chiasms. And if this just goes over your head, that's completely okay. I just need you to know it's there. All right. Genesis 1 is what you call a chiasm. So a chiasm is where a literary structure has a grammatical structure of A, B, C, D, and then in some way the rest of the story repeats itself. So it might go A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. Might do that. Or it may go A, B, C, D, C, B, A. So it's either going to parallel or it's going to mirror. So you have the parallel chiasm, or you have what we call the inverted chiasm. The parallel chiasm is like if you were to take this story, put it on a sheet of paper, and split that down in the middle, and then put those two halves together, fold it in half. Each part of the story, each half of the story would fold, and they would line up perfectly with one another. That's a parallel. then there's the inverted chiasm, which it would be more like it's shaped like an hourglass. And so in an inverted chiasm, you have everything points to a center point. So that's the one that goes point A in the story, and then point B in the story, and then point C in the story, and then point D in the story. But then the fifth point in that section would look a lot like point C. And then the sixth would look a lot like point B. And then the seventh would look a lot like point A. And so that's an inverted chiasm. Genesis 1 is very unique in the sense that it is actually both chiasms. It's both types. Here's what I mean by this. So you have the Genesis 1 narrative in day 1. Day 1 correlates actually really well with day 4. And then day 2 correlates with day 5. And day 3 correlates with day 6. That's your parallel. Point A, point B, point C. And then you have A, B, C again. So you have day 1, God says, let there be light. God separates the light, creates day and night, right? And there was evening and morning. Well, look at day 4, which starts in verse 14. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. In day 4, he's doing the same thing he did in day 1, only now he's adding to it. See, in day 1, he separated, and in day 4 he's filling. So in day 4 he's filling the sky, the expanse of the sky, with these lights, the stars, the sun, the moon, whereas in day 1 he just created light. Well, day 2 correlates with day 5. Look at day 2, right? So day 2 starts in verse 6. God said, let there be an expanse. This is what we're talking about, the sky, between the waters, separating water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse sky. So now skip on down to verse, verse 20. Then God said, verse 20, day 5, God said, let the water swarm with living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So in day 2, he separates the waters, he creates the expanse, he calls it sky, and he calls the water the seas. And then in day 5, he fills those seas with living creatures, and he fills the sky with flying birds. And then day 3 starts in verse, where is this? Verse 11, then God said, let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, fruit trees on the earth, seed according to their kinds. The earth produced vegetation. And in back up to verse 10, God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the water he called seas. That's happening in day 3. We'll go down to day 6, right? Day 6 starts in verse 24. God said, let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wild life of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. So in day 3, God creates the earth, he separates the waters, and he creates earth, dry land. And then in day 6, he fills that dry land. So in this chiasm, in this poem, you have day 1 correlates with day 4, day 2 correlates with day 5, and day 3 correlates with day 6. This is a parallel chiasm. But in another way, the Genesis passage is also an inverted chiasm. So, and you can see this just based on the size of the paragraphs. In this way, the chiasm is actually visual as opposed to literary. So in chapter 1, if you look at verses 1 through, I'm just taking a look at my physical Bible here. If you take a look at verses 1 through 5, you have what I've heard one theologian call a baby paragraph, and its size, the size of the paragraph, he calls it like a baby paragraph. And then if you look at verses 6 through 8, he says you would have what you would call a mommy paragraph. And then in verses 9 through 13, you have what he would call a daddy paragraph. And then verses 14 through 19, you have another daddy paragraph. And then verses 20 through 22 or 23, you have a mommy paragraph. And then verses 24 through 25, you have a baby paragraph. So in this way, the chiasm actually makes more of a diamond shape is what it would look like. So you could have an inverted chiasm would either look like an hourglass, or it would look like a diamond. And so in this sense, the chiasm actually gets bigger in the middle and then smaller on each end, top and bottom. So why does this matter? Well, when you see an inverted chiasm, or when you see a parallel chiasm, the author writes it this way poetically, by the way, for the reader to focus on one main point. With a parallel chiasm, he wants you to look at how the two mirror each other, and there's probably something that happens right in that middle part where they start to mirror. Or in the inverted chiasm, you have the points point to a center point, whether that is they actually get smaller at that point or if they get larger at this point, whatever it is. But the point is they point to the center point of the passage. So when you look at Genesis 1 and you look at these paragraph sizes and you see this inverted chiasm and everything is pointing to this center point, well, if you have 7 days, where would you expect the center point of 7 days to be? Well, you would probably expect it to be in day 4, right? That's the halfway between the 7 days. Well, actually almost right in the middle. And you can do this in the Hebrew. You can count the Hebrew words, and you'll find there actually is a center word for this. But when you take this chiasm and you see the chiasm and you get really excited about it, and then you follow it to its main middle point, the word that you find in the very middle is this word moedim. It's the word where we translate seasons. So look at verse 14 again. Verse 14 again, God happens to be in verse 14. God happens to be creating lights again. So verse 14, then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night. They will serve as signs for seasons. There's your moedim, seasons, and for days and years. So seasons is your middle word. And if you're an English speaker, you're saying, who cares? And that's fair. Who cares? And if you were a Hebrew reader, you would probably say, well, kind of interesting, because the Hebrew reader is going to see moedim, and he's going to know that moedim is actually one of 4 Hebrew words used for Sabbath rest. So in the book of Exodus, God institutes the Sabbath rest for the Israelites. Now, the scholar who I learned all this from is Marty Solomon. He's a Jewish Christian scholar. And he pointed all this out, and he makes the point of, hey, it's almost anticlimactic when you find the moedim. You find the seasons is the middle word. But when you understand that moedim is one of 4 words used for Sabbath, and you understand that the Israelites, who were the original readers, were people who had been enslaved for 400 years, people who knew nothing about rest, people whose entire value and identity was found in the fact that they produced something, that the more they worked, the more they produced, the more value they had. And so in order to have value, they had to keep working, and rest wasn't something that was a part of who they were. When you take that people and you bring them out, they're going to be people who are going to continue finding their identity in what they do. And so what God does in the book of Exodus, one of the very first things he institutes is what he calls the Sabbath, or in Hebrew we say Shabbat, the Sabbath, the Shabbat. And this Shabbat is that one day a week you are supposed to rest. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. You rest. This is not a law you're allowed to break. This is God's law. On the 7th day, you rest, because that's what God does on the 7th day. So moedim is another word for rest. If Moses wants the people of Israel to understand who God is and how he's different from the Egyptian gods, the first thing he wants them to know is that he's a God who creates order. He's a God who fills his world with life, not death. And he creates rest. So when we ask ourselves, okay, what's the story? What's the story of Genesis 1? What's the story of Genesis 1 through 3? Well, one of the most significant points in the story is that God is a God who orders things. And to order things, to create order, is to create life, to separate the chaos, create order, create life, and create rest. I think a big part of order is understanding life and understanding rest. Too often, we try to create order in our lives by producing things. In our Western American culture, we believe the best way to create a life that is good is to produce. So we focus on what we can work towards. We focus on how much can I do. I need to be making more money. I need to be working more hours. I need to be accomplishing more things. I need to be there for more people. I need to be loving better. We need to do. But what God shows us in the Genesis 1 story is that our value, our identity is not found in what we do, but rather in what God has done. That's a point right there at the beginning. I've heard this all my life in the gospel. The gospel of Jesus is that our salvation is not based on what I do, but based on what Christ has already done on the cross. We don't need those books of the Bible in order to learn that point. We do need those books. We need that story. We need the gospel. But in order to understand that our value, our identity is based on what God has done, that's right there in Genesis 1. It's right there. Who you are is not determined on what you do. Who you are is determined on what God did. He created you. He created order. Your job is to rest in what He's already done. God brings order out of chaos in Genesis 1. But also I think in our everyday lives, God brings order out of chaos. The chaos that is our lives, the struggles we have in our families, the chaos we have in our work, the chaos we have in our relationships, the chaos we have in our anxiety, the chaos we have in our sleeplessness, the chaos we have in our insecurities, these pieces, these forms of chaos, God can and is willing to bring order to those things. One of my prayers as I enter into worship every Sunday is that God would help me to take the mosaic that is my life and take all the pieces of it and lay them down at His feet so that He can take that mosaic, take those pieces and rearrange them in a way where He's at the top and He's the one who's creating order. When I try to create order in my life, what I end up doing is I just create more chaos. But when I hand things over to God and I let Him create, He creates order. And what's amazing is that He shows us that our job in this is to be people of rest. When He creates, we rest. We rest in what He created. Order, according to God, is life, and order, according to God, is rest. The ultimate point, I think, of Genesis 1 through 25 is that God brings order out of chaos. We don't bring order out of chaos. God brings order out of chaos. Whatever is chaotic in your life, hand it over to God and let Him create order. And in that, and in only that, will you find true rest. So the story is going to continue in verses 26 through 30 of chapter 1, and we're going to see God create man. And we're going to see our relationship with God begin. And we're going to talk a lot about what it means to be made in the image of God, to be an image bearer of God. So with that said, let me close this out. And my encouragement to you this week is to ask yourself, where's the chaos in my life? And I want you through prayer to hand that over to God and let Him be the God who creates order out of that chaos. And you just rest in that. All right, we will see you next week.